Blackleg Sanji is easily the most contentious character among the Straw Hat Pirates. Despite his diehard fans, he gets a lot of hate due to the overuse of his pervert gag, especially post-time skip. That hate isn't exactly unwarranted, at least in my opinion. The gag can be extremely obnoxious, and during certain stretches of the story, the only screen time he gets is when he's being a degenerate. Fishman Island.
Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck, man? Get your ass on, boy.
During my experience of going through One Piece, I, like many others, found myself severely put off by Sanji more and more as time went on. Baratie was and still is my favorite arc from the East Blue Saga, and Sanji was one of my favorite Straw Hats pretty much until Thriller Bark. But then everything through there to Punk Hazard left a lot to be desired. Whole Cake Island obviously did wonders for his character, and I do love the way that he was written during that arc. Although at that point, a lot of damage had already been done. I know that for a lot of people, Sanji's low points aren't seen as a big deal, either because they don't find the gags too annoying or because the substance underneath those gags resonates so strongly with them that nothing can make them hate the character. For the longest time, I could never understand this sentiment. If anything, I was more irritated that the better sides of the character had become so deeply buried under an insufferable anime trope. Honestly, I still am. Only now, after having rewatched the majority of the series, I finally understand why people are so devoted to Sanji in spite of his flaws. When looking past the tiresome caricature, there is an elegantly written character with some beautiful themes. Today, that's the character I'm going to be talking about. So no matter if you're a Sanji lover or a hater, stick around and hopefully by the end you'll have a deeper appreciation for the somewhat controversial cook of the Straw Hat crew. Let's begin by discussing some of Sanji's defining character traits. I think that even in times where he's primarily used as a gag character, the one quality that consistently permeates Sanji's writing is his selflessness. Going all the way back to Baratie, Sanji's arc was centered around him learning to prioritize his own dreams. He struggled immensely with this before the Straw Hats arrived, and it was only after meeting them that he decided to make his first selfish decision in years. A great scene that illustrates this is when Sanji's watching Zoro's fight with Mihawk. Once it becomes clear that Zoro is in over his head, Sanji becomes shocked and frustrated even. He yells at him to abandon his dream and that it shouldn't be hard to choose to live. He can't understand why Zoro would be so willing to risk his own life without considering those he'd be leaving behind. At that point, Sanji was of the mindset that his dreams were worthless. He believed that sticking by Zeph and the cooks would always take precedence over his ambition. What's interesting is that the audacity of Zoro shows Sanji what it's like to die by your dreams, but it teaches Zoro the opposite lesson. This is where Zoro learns to take the slower path and to put his dreams second to his crew's, specifically Luffy's. The decision to fight Mihawk was a humbling experience for Zoro, but a moment of great inspiration for Sanji. All of this is to say that during the Baratie arc, there wasn't a selfish bone in Sanji's body. Even in the present, he's extremely selfless and prioritizes the needs of others before his own. But where exactly does this come from? On one hand, it's a manifestation of one of Sanji's other major characteristics, his compassion. Sanji is kind and caring, sometimes to a fault. An obvious but effective example is when he makes the decision to feed Gin, even though it leads to Don Krieg's arrival. It's quite literally impossible for Sanji to look at someone who's hungry and to not feed them. He's always looking out for his crew and anticipating their needs before they do. He never asks for anything in return because he truly finds fulfillment in taking care of others. At the age of 8 years old, he'd go so far as to cook a gourmet meal for a mouse that others would see as a pest that needs to be exterminated. At his core, Sanji is someone that is sensitive, considerate, and deeply empathetic towards others, so it's no wonder that he's so selfless. However, these qualities were seen as weak and pathetic by his brothers and his father Judge. His compassion is the very reason why he was considered a failure. So on the other hand, his selflessness is actually a reflection of his self-worth. He puts others before himself because the idea that he is worth less than those around him is something that was instilled deep within his psyche. Sanji was constantly punished and abused just for being who he was. As a result, he subconsciously puts his own needs to the side and doesn't always see the value he brings to his friends. It's why he waited so long to leave the Baratier. He felt indebted to Zeph, but he didn't even register that his dreams were worthy enough to take such a big leap. Even after setting sail with the Straw Hats, there were many times where he quickly put his life on the line for others, such as in Drum Island when he and Luffy were being chased by the rabbits, and in Skypiea when Usopp was about to be attacked by Enel. When Zoro asked Kuma to take his life instead of Luffy's, Sanji outright stated that Zoro's dream was just as important as Luffy's, which is why Sanji wanted to sacrifice himself instead. But I think the best example is when Sanji left the crew behind during Whole Cake Island. Despite how difficult it was for him, Sanji ultimately believed that he would be a burden to involve the crew. He didn't think he was worth the trouble because in his eyes, him leaving the crew wouldn't change much. He didn't fully expect Luffy to come after him, and when he did, he tried to push him away, something that he viewed as an act of kindness. I think that Sanji's behavior during the beginning of this arc makes a lot of sense when you consider his emotions surrounding his family. His childhood trauma was so intense that merely being around his father and siblings again reactivated all of his deepest emotional wounds. Even after years of personal growth and new relationships, his mind was easily distorted by the triggers of his past. This is a very real experience for people with emotional trauma, and it can be extremely difficult to work through. Thankfully, Sanji had Luffy to snap him back to reality and help him heal again. We can see the effects of that healing in Wano when Sanji asks Robin for help with Black Maria. In that moment, he remembers that he can trust his friends and that it's okay to let others assist him instead of the other way around. I think it's also interesting that Sanji's compulsive tendencies to be selfless and put others before himself are sometimes exactly what leads to him being a little bit inconsiderate of others in a way. In trying to be so protective of others, he sometimes indirectly ends up ignoring their own wishes and desires. He ignores their own autonomy. In the case of his friends like Robin and the other Straw Hats, he struggles with asking for help because he doesn't want to be a burden and he doesn't want to put them in any danger. He would rather face that danger himself. But the whole point of having friends and having a crew rather is having people around that are willing to share burdens with you, are willing to face the same danger that you two are willing to face for each other. By trying to take on all that responsibility himself, he's actually depriving his friends of the proper space to be true friends to him. So by being too selfless, it sometimes results in being a little bit selfish, ironically. But having the Straw Hats around, he's able to confront that behavior and he's able to be around people that will just help him out anyway most of the time. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the video. Now let's talk about Sanji's identity as a chef. Sanji's cooking is reflective of most of his positive qualities, including his selflessness. Cooking doesn't have to be an act of care, but it very often is. The smiles and satisfaction that people get from eating food that you made can be just as rewarding as the food itself. This is probably the main reason why Sanji enjoys cooking so much. Watching his mother happily eat his food, even when it wasn't the best, were some of the only moments that he felt truly loved as a child. Not only did this encourage his pursuit of the craft, it gave him a means to channel all of the qualities that were rejected by his father. Through cooking, Sanji expresses empathy, kindness, and affection. Every single meal that he makes is an act of love. Cooking takes a lot of time and patience, so it is not something done on a whim. And when Sanji cooks, he rarely does it for himself. Every ingredient and every spice is added with careful consideration of another person. He's someone who naturally wants to take care of others, so what better way to do that than by offering them a hearty nutrition and complex flavors. But cooking isn't just something Sanji is gifted at because of his desire to feed people. He's someone that meets all of the criteria for a good chef. He's detail-oriented, passionate, graceful, patient, and flexible. To be a chef, you need to be preoccupied with details to create intricate flavor profiles. You need to be passionate and enthusiastic about each and every dish to ensure that the end result is filled with love. You need to be graceful and patient so that every recipe is made with tenderness and precision. You need to be flexible so that you can make adjustments on the fly and create innovative combinations. Sanji embodies all of these characteristics. His gracefulness and passion come across in his natural disposition and approach to life. His patience and flexibility manifest in his clever solutions and clutch moments. And his focus on details are shown most in his consideration of his crewmates' needs, allowing him to anticipate problems before they happen. These are all qualities that Sanji was born with, and I believe this is why the art of cooking was such a natural fit for him at a young age. It gave him the perfect outlet to be himself in every facet, but I also believe that through his love of cooking, these traits were further reinforced and strengthened. Through his cooking, Sanji is able to become his best self while also being supported and inspired. Before we get into this next part of the video, let's take a look at 2 clips from the anime, starting with one of Sanji's first appearances.
うるせえな。ひょっとしてあれがあいつの仲間か？自分でやってくれ。ああ、海よ。今日という日の出会いをありがとう。ああ、来いよ。この苦しみに耐えきれぬ僕を笑うがいい。僕は君となら海賊にでも悪魔にでもなり下がれる覚悟が今できた。しかしなんという悲劇が。僕らにはあまりにも大きな障害が。
And now a clip from a much more recent arc, Wano.
すごい威力だナミさん。幸せパンチ。
何？この人昨日のおそばマスク。
ナミさん、ナミさんの豊かに流れる大河のような。
Now, if you ask me, there's a clear-cut difference between these 2 gags. It showcases an evolution, or rather a de-evolution, of the way Oda has written the character over time. It's a change that, in my opinion, is one of Oda's biggest failings as a writer. When the live-action One Piece first came out, I remember a lot of people referring to the new version of Sanji as a drastically different portrayal. Personally, that never made sense to me. Sure, he was far less animated and sensationalized, but so were many of the other characters. When it came to his more romantically inclined character traits, they were definitely toned down quite a bit. However, it was still an accurate depiction of how Sanji was written at that point in the story. It was the character that I and many of us initially fell in love with. It only feels so different from the anime Sanji because that character was practically abandoned by Oda for a long period of time. Sanji was originally portrayed to be a chivalrous, fanatical, lover boy type character. The jokes came from his lack of self-awareness. He was so intense and overconfident that he couldn't actually keep any woman interested. I guess you could say that his obliviousness and fanaticism are still very much a part of him, but his chivalrous and romantic sides have been swapped for lustfulness and perversion. Gradually over time, Sanji's character gag became less about his inability to satisfy his intense desire for romance and more about his basic obsession with women and their bodies. The punchline is supposed to be how shameless he can be. Now, this isn't particularly unusual when it comes to anime. There are plenty of characters that take on the humorous pervert role. You may even find it funny from time to time. These jokes are usually meant to mock the perverted behavior more than anything. However, it becomes annoying when these jokes are seemingly never ending. It's also hard not to make any beloved character come off as obnoxious when written this way, because at the end of the day, it's just simply not a good look. In Sanji's case, these sorts of gags have become a constant element of his screen time, and at times they're downright problematic.
Why don't you come on in and have a seat real quick?
Okay.
Up until Thriller Bark, Sanji still had a lot of substance in between his less charming moments. But for whatever reason, Oda decided to flip the switch and make nearly every other panel with Sanji centered around his gag, while at the same time making the gag itself 10 times more annoying. Yes, I understand there were some in-story reasons for this, mainly in Fishman Island. That still doesn't change the fact that it was way overdone. It's really hard to overlook when his only major highlights of an arc are being a pervert, telling Jinbei to kill himself, and one semi-decent fight. In Whole Cake Island, Oda returned to Sanji's roots, and to no surprise, nearly everyone agreed it was a significant improvement. He backpedals a bit in Wano, but overall, Sanji is definitely in a much better place now. But it's a real shame that such a significant portion of the story turned an enjoyable character into a shell of his former self. My point at the end of the day is that Sanji's extreme pervertedness is a misrepresentation of the true character by the author himself. It's not how Sanji was originally written, and it's not who he was originally intended to be. More than anything else, post-time skip Sanji is a reflection of Japan's culture surrounding sexual humor. These types of jokes are commonplace in anime and manga. It's actually more noteworthy when an anime doesn't have a designated pervert character. But because of the frequency in which Oda uses these gags for Sanji, they get conflated with his actual character. When looking at the portions of the story where Sanji is portrayed closer to how he was in his introduction, you'll find a different personality on display. In reality, Sanji is just a fanatic for romance. He falls in love way too easily and tries way too hard. Even though his views are a bit old-fashioned, he's generally chivalrous and respectful when not being used as a vehicle for a gag. Part of this comes from the values instilled in him by Zeph, but I also believe it goes a little bit deeper. During his early childhood, the only two people that showed him kindness and love were his mother and sister. In other words, the only people that were there for him were women. I think that because of this, Sanji unconsciously learned to put women on a higher pedestal than men. This, combined with the traditional values taught to him by Zeph, manifest as Sanji's obsession with women. It's also possible that the limited access he had to unconditional love as a child created a stronger desire for love as an adult. In psychology, it's been found that those who received plenty of love or no love at all usually end up fixating less on a need for connection as they get older. However, those who received love only in small doses tend to have a higher drive to search for intimate relationships. So Sanji's childhood, his values, and his enthusiastic nature all play a part in his behavior towards women. Contrary to Oda's insistence, he's more than a freak who can't control himself. Underneath the constant sexual humor, he's just a guy who's a little too preoccupied with impressing women and has absolutely no idea how to take things slow. I feel like I should also clarify that this is just my interpretation of the character, or at least this specific aspect of the character. My point is just that this side of Sanji in the later stages of the story is mostly inconsistent with how it was originally portrayed. It's way more extreme, it's way more obnoxious, and even though in the early stages of the story it was still kind of there was something with a little bit more substance and personality underneath that. And when you focus on that side of the character, it's a lot easier to enjoy and tolerate. It sucks that Oda kind of bastardized what could have been an otherwise really refreshing take on some of these tropes, but I don't think it's crazy to try to separate and compartmentalize the less flattering aspects of Sanji's character in order to better appreciate what is underneath. So we've talked about one of Sanji's deepest inner struggles, his low self-esteem, as well as how that struggle plays into his most defining character trait, his selflessness. We've talked about his personality and how it's directly tied to his skills as a chef. We've also gone over his fixation with romance and how that got converted into a sexual obsession. These are all things that have to do with Sanji as a standalone character. But how does the Straw Hat crew fit into all of this? What significance does the crew hold for him, and how is it that he's changed since coming aboard their ship? I mentioned earlier how during the Baratier arc, Sanji was unwilling to follow his dreams until interacting with and observing Luffy and Zoro. Essentially, they showed him what it looks like to follow one's dream with absolute resolve. They showed him that it's okay to put yourself first once in a while. In typical One Piece fashion, this realization is liberating for Sanji. It allowed him to truly break free from the chains of his family trauma. Even though Zeph healed his need for parental love and support, the Straw Hats pushed him to finally start living for himself. But they didn't just motivate him to live for himself, they gave him an environment where he could finally be himself. Zeph mentions a few times that staying at the Bratier was holding Sanji back. Yes, the restaurant was his home as well as a place where he could embrace his love for cooking. However, something was still missing. Sanji was too comfortable at the Bratier. It was monumental for his growth as a child, but after a certain point, it only hindered his development. Aside from feeling indebted to Zeph, I think that Sanji found it difficult to leave because of how much he endured from his previous family. The hole that was filled by Zeph and the other cooks was so enormous that he was afraid of going back to being alone. Sure, at any point he could have found a crew, but that would be met with a great risk. Such a beautiful bond was so hard to come by in the first place for him, so how could he leave that behind? How could he possibly face those feelings of isolation and loneliness again if he didn't find another family? In come the Straw Hats. They had only known each other for about a day, but the kindness and friendship offered by Luffy was strong enough to quell Sanji's fears. The crew displayed a bond like the one he already shared with Zeph, and I believe this allowed Sanji to see himself being happy by their side. Of course, it was still hard to say goodbye. I mean, he practically had to be forced to leave, but he never would have even considered setting sail if he didn't feel safe enough with the people that offered him a ride. The Straw Hats didn't just give him a method of going after his dream. They offered him a hand to walk him through the fear of taking that first step. They gave him real friendship like he had never experienced before. More importantly though, they gave him a higher purpose. Sanji was able to cook as much as he wanted at the Bratier, but as we've discussed, what Sanji really cares about is being able to take care of those he loves. He has so much love and nowhere to direct it, outside of his cooking that is. The difference between cooking for disgruntled, unappreciative customers and cooking for your family is all the world. Sanji is happiest when he's able to connect with people intimately, both in a platonic and romantic sense. He's most inspired when he's able to support those people who are also supporting him. So by joining the crew, he joined an environment that met all of his needs, so that he could then follow his dream. Basically, Zeph helped Sanji to grow up, but the Straw Hats gave him the means to live his life. Unconditional love and belonging are necessary for us to learn to value ourselves, but not everyone is lucky enough to have them constantly provided. Some people may be completely deprived of such basic humanity. They're told that their feelings and dreams don't matter. They're told that who they are is wrong, that their natural selves are a failure or a waste of life. Sometimes when these beliefs are instilled at a young age, they become a part of one's identity. However, kindness and compassion can prevail even in places devoid of light. Despite being punished for showing empathy, Sanji held on to his softer tendencies. Through fleeting moments of warmth from his mother and sister, he was able to grow a small amount of affection for himself. Through the exploration of cooking, he was able to express his personality and give his soul a voice. And through perseverance and perhaps sheer luck, he was able to find a father to repair his heart. Ultimately, Sanji was able to turn something that was said to be his biggest weakness into his greatest strength. It's important to care for those around us as much as we can. In times where we have the choice of being compassionate and graceful, it's often worth the gamble. Empathy is one of our most powerful abilities as humans. It's also important to remember that we are just as worthy of love as others. Our own needs and desires matter, and sometimes we have to put ourselves first in order to truly do what's best. Furthermore, you have to take risks if you really want to grow. You have to leave people behind when your time in each other's lives has served its purpose. This isn't a bad thing, it's a part of life. Just remember to hold gratitude in your heart, no matter how much you didn't get along, and you'll be sure to meet them again in others. That is what Sanji's story is all about. That is what makes him special. That is the struggle of selfishness.